All right. Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast. I am with a very special guest today. We have Victoria Rivera on the show. Victoria is a wellness psychotherapist. She has a private practice in New York City. Victoria originally attended Colgate University, attending Columbia University School of Social Work for grad school, and then beginning her career as a social worker in the Bronx. During her work, she completed the New York University Institute for Psychoanalytic Education, Adult Psychodynamic Psychotherapy Program, a certification in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and the Institute for Integrative Nutrition's Health Coaching Certification Program. Victoria started her private practice in 2014, incorporating all of her knowledge and experience to providing holistically oriented treatment to New Yorkers who are type A personalities with high functioning anxiety, who struggle with self-care and finding meaning in their lives. Victoria has expanded her work to corporate America, providing wellness workshops and meditation training to businesses in New York City. Some of the companies she's worked with are Ballet Hispanico, Welnys, and the C3 Method, and NAP York. Victoria, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I kind of wanted to get started just by kind of, it sounds like you have a really interesting path, into this kind of line of work. And I was just curious what originally piqued your curiosity.
So I actually got really lucky when I was in college at Colgate, in undergrad. I wanted to be a physician. I started taking biology classes, and then I took some psychology classes. I was super interested, much more interested in psychology, and did so much better in psychology than in biology. And I also was interested in religion and sociology and anthropology. So I just started taking those types of classes. And I think what really solidified kind of going into social work and becoming a therapist was going to India. I studied abroad in India when I was a junior in college. And, I don't know if you've ever been or, just going into a totally different culture and meeting all new people that thought differently. It was just so, it was so interesting and so amazing to see how much the culture and society affected how people were like living. And so I really felt like, this would be something that I would really like to do, is like learn more about how people are affected by their culture and by society. And so that's when I applied to school at Columbia University and got my degree in social work. And then kind of from there, I wanted to actually work with families and children. I was really interested in helping kids, learn how to, cope with stress and managing things in their lives. Unfortunately, I was actually really sensitive more to kids than to adults. Because they didn't have a lot of control over their environment. And so, if they were having, a conflicted time with like their families or at school, you don't really have a lot of, you see the kid maybe for 45 minutes, 50 minutes out of the week. So the treatment for them, for me, it just didn't feel like, I didn't feel like I was doing much. So I thought, I would rather actually work with adults. And so in the Bronx, I worked at a day treatment program, which is a program that serves people who have both mental health issues and substance abuse issues. And I did that for about 2 years. And then I worked at a community mental health center in Manhattan for 12 years, providing individual and group therapy to people who had diagnosed with schizoaffective or schizophrenia, to bipolar disorder, to somebody who just had a breakup and needed support. So I had a lot of experience, and how I got to where I am today and why I call myself a wellness psychotherapist is in that experience that I had. Unfortunately, there's a stigma of mental health and mental health issues, when really what it is, it's a reaction that people have. Like, people are depressed for a reason. They're anxious for a reason. Have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. I mean, those reasons are a little bit more difficult to discern. I mean, some of it's genetic, some of it's like, past trauma. So it's really hard. But the thing that they have in common is, what can you do now to kind of help yourself? And it goes back to really physiology and biology first and foremost, and then the psychology of how you think. And so in doing kind of like my training, of course, doing psychodynamic psychoanalytic training, I learned a lot about the psychology of people, but what we miss, I think, is the biology and physiology of people. And so hence the mindfulness-based meditation training, and also the integrative nutritional health coaching degree that
Right.
I have.
Right.
It's more holistically looking at the person, as opposed to just saying, oh, you have this disorder and this is the treatment, because we know that actually that does not work, now that we have so much research to back up that we're really unique organisms that require different ways of like kind of different treatments and different ways of like working with ourselves.
Absolutely. And I do want to get into that, but first, just going back to something you said about, the trip to India, I'm curious, what did you see in that kind of culture or that society? Was it something that you saw that they were sort of doing better than maybe, the Western culture or American culture, that kind of got you to think, okay, what if there's a better way to do this? Or
Mhm.
what was the thought process there?
Well, that's a really good question. I think sometimes we like to idealize like other, cultures and countries. And I think India kind of gets that because of the yoga, the meditation. So there's obviously lots of issues and problems and stuff. And I think probably when I was there, what I saw was a lot of poverty.
Uh-huh.
Nothing that I had ever seen in the US before. And it was jarring, and it was really sad in many ways. But I was looking at it through my lens of being a Westerner, and being from the US. And even though my family's like working class, I, I, I really felt like, I had so much privilege and so much gratitude for what I did have. I think that like kind of was one thing that struck me. But I think probably the most important thing was that even though there was poverty, and not everybody obviously was poor, but you could really see it. There were slums, there were people, begging for money on the streets, kids begging for money, which you don't see in America. And hopefully we'll never see that. I think that really shifted my perception of like poverty and help, but also people still were happy, in
Mhm.
some ways, and or seemingly happy or joyful, in being where they were and where their lives were. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, that they were, I don't know exactly what they were experiencing, but from my perspective, having conversations with Native people, they seem to be okay with, living their lives day to day, making ends meet, and finding joy in small things like a Bollywood movie,
Mhm.
or, having a great like dosa or something like that. So I think that's kind of where I think that really shifted my mindset on how how I was living in this world, in the Western world, and being exposed to a totally different culture, and what I could do here to help, with bringing that forth. And I guess that's probably why that purpose and meaning is very, very important for me and the work that I do, and helping people understand that, because we can, on so many levels, take things for granted,
Mhm.
and also not have, things that are really important in our lives, or priorities, which are like relationships, which are connecting with nature and the earth, which is, our environment, intellectually stimulating ourselves. So I think that that's probably why it shifted so much for me. It was such a powerful experience.
Right, right. That's very cool. Yeah, just being able to see people who, I mean, even if there is such, extreme poverty and suffering going on, people still being able to, I guess, take advantage or just, you know, um, enjoy the good things in life that
Hmm.
maybe we kind of take for granted in America. uh, I it brought to mind, I don't know if you've seen the study about basically that sort of wealth curve where it's you know your level of happiness, they say, kind of goes up until that, I think it was like $75,000, and then once you make over that, it kind of just flatlines. So kind of from my understanding of that study, it was kind of like, all right, so yes, it does make you happier to have enough money that you don't have to worry about paying the bills month to month, and you're not worried over all of those little big financial stressors. But then once you actually have the financial resources to live comfortably, more money is not necessarily equal to more happiness.
Right. Yeah.
But
Like you said, more money, more problems.
yeah, right. Right. So okay, so you were talking about, I think you briefly mentioned the psychodynamic or psychoanalytics. Can you tell
Hmm.
me, and can you tell our listeners just a little, what is that, and sort of what how do you incorporate that into your practice now?
So, psychoanalytic therapy or treatment is actually that classic, like, therapist sitting in a chair and the patient in the couch and the therapist is writing or napping. You see a lot of like little jokes and cartoons about that. So
Right.
really what that is it's you kind of have to think about like us as like an iceberg. So the tip of the iceberg is what you can see and what you're aware of, what our conscious awareness is. But below the surface, there's an unconscious, and then there, even below that, there's a Carl Jung talked about collective unconscious, which I think actually is something that we don't really talk a lot about, but it is also really important in understanding, why we do what we do as humans. So, what psychoanalytic therapy is really about understanding the unconscious processes that are going on, that are kind of motivating you to do the things that you do, to feel the way that you feel, and to think how you think. And so psychodynamic is an offshoot of that, and it's a little, I mean, psychoanalytic training is much deeper, and there's you have to do it for 5 years. It's almost like a PhD program. But psychoanalytic is something that you can have a good understanding of the psychoanalytic process, the psychoanalytic process, but not necessarily go that deep where you're sitting behind your patient and writing down your notes and seeing them for 3 or sometimes even 5 times out of the week, and the patient is just like kind of free associating and just saying whatever is on their mind. And so the analyst like will write down and every once in a while maybe give an interpretation or say something, but not often. So psychodynamic has some of those elements, but the process is that you're talking to the person face to face. You're building a connection with them, and whatever comes up for them, you're listening for the unconscious stuff that they're talking about, and then you're helping them to see how it's coming out in their behaviors and their thoughts and their patterns and ways of being in their relationships, but particularly like their core beliefs that they have about themselves, and helping them to understand how to deal with that, how to understand their core beliefs and how their core beliefs get played out in their day-to-day life. And obviously people, when they come to therapy, there's a problem. There's usually a presenting problem that has prompted them to come to see somebody like me. And usually that problem is like just, again, the tip of the iceberg of deeper unconscious and even collective unconscious uh, um, thoughts and ways of being.
Hmm. So it sounds like then is the goal to kind of help them or kind of bring to the surface or help them understand the core beliefs or processes that are sort of driving their conscious behavior and creating the problems that maybe are bringing them to, see you in the first place.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. That, and then I would also add is the relationship. And that's why I prefer the psychodynamic method, and is because you are connecting with somebody on a personal level. You're developing that sense of safety, that relationship that is really, really important, especially for somebody who has had a history of trauma or just, I mean, there's macro trauma, there's, which is, the big traumas that, people think of, child abuse and neglect and so forth. But there's also micro traumas, which are just as impactful, and that could be emotional neglect and deprivation. Kind of feeling like your parent criticized you or didn't like you in some way. That impacts people profoundly. And so helping people to have a connection with somebody who they can trust, especially if they haven't had that in their lives, or they've had very few people that they can trust, is a huge part of why treatment actually works. And that takes time. So not only are you, again, like you said beautifully, building a self-awareness about, why how your unconscious and your beliefs are propelling your behavior, you're also building a trusting relationship with somebody who really cares and who's really listening to you and has the knowledge and understanding of figuring out, okay, this is kind of typically, I mean, I use a lot of like evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology just because, I mean, this is what we have, right? I mean, we've been doing a lot. There's been so many great studies in neuroscience and biology, I mean, everything, and kind of trying to pull together like what it is to just like kind of be a human, and then what it is for you to be a human with your individual experience, and trying to help somebody figure that out. And I think that I mean, if there's another way, I don't know, but that's been successful, at least in my practice, and also for myself as well.
Hmm. Right. And just that kind of like human connection or being able to like really share something with someone else seems like something that's like really important just for, you know, just our general like relationships that we have with people, outside of, just therapy. But I'm curious kind of like what do you feel like there's any sort of main difference, say between, if someone say is seeing you and then they have, their best friend who they talk to about a lot of their, you know, deeper issues and someone to confide in, what what element does the, your training and everything play and able to in order to kind of help them move past whatever they're kind of dealing with?
Yeah. Well, you're right. Relationships are very, very healing. And having a really good friend, a best friend that you could talk to and that you could say anything to, or a partner, or anybody is great. And actually, we all need that in addition to having a therapist. And this is the difference, I'll tell you, is that as a therapist, the training is such that we train. There's I don't remember who said this, but with a third ear. When you're listening to your best friend or your partner, you're not necessarily listening with that third ear. You can send, hopefully you're compassionate and empathetic and loving, kind to them, and they are to you when they're listening to you. And we are that in addition to everything else. But what the third ear is really about, hearing the underlying patterns and the underlying issues that the person is going through, and experiencing and exhibiting as we're talking to them. So, your best friend might not hear that because they've known you for this period of time, and there's a block, right? There's this, we all kind of have a level of awareness of ourselves, and then we don't have an awareness sometimes about all about ourselves. So there's something that a friend could notice about us, and then they'll tell us, and we might not be able to really kind of hear that, or maybe we are able to hear it if we really trust them. So really what we do is we are just much more objective in terms of being able to see you as a person in the environment and based on your experiences. So a best friend obviously is great. Everybody needs one. Everybody needs a good partner or partners and people in their lives. Social wellness is actually a very important part of, the work that I do with people, is helping to connect with them. But again, a lot of people who've had trauma, micro, macro trauma, especially emotional deprivation, they have a hard time really trusting people. So they can have a best friend and not really tell them everything. So again, we're fostering and facilitating a trusting relationship so that we can really help them with moving forward, and then also being able to have more trusting relationships in their lives moving forward. So that's
Right.
the difference.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's interesting. Um, I'm curious as far as, you mentioned in your bio as far as working with these, type A New Yorkers. Um, and I'm curious what, I guess, what are the different challenges as far as, them versus your typical client, if there is a typical client, maybe there's not. But what specifically do you work with them to help them? I think you mentioned really to help them find meaning in their lives.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to understand so another part of like the wellness. So when I call myself a wellness psychotherapist because the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has 8 dimensions of wellness that they work through, right? And I'll go through them, and then I just added one. So the first is physical. The second is emotional. This is how I kind of frame it. The third is spiritual. The fourth is social. The fifth for me is intellectual. I feel like we always need to learn. The sixth is occupational. The seventh is financial. The eighth is environmental. And the ninth is service. So that's kind of how I like frame the work that I do with people. So that eighth one, environment, is very, very interesting. So a lot of people who live in New York aren't actually really from New York. They come and, there's bulk multi-billion-dollar companies here and corporations, and people who kind of are more on the anxious side end up and also have kind of are perfectionists, or they want to succeed. They want to be successful in what our culture and country deems as being successful, which is like having financial resources, having status and power and money and all of those things, right? So you get a lot of people who come to this city wanting that, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're high achievers. They like to work and like to work hard. Now, what I've noticed is New York in and of itself is kind of an anxious environment. So when we talk about environmental wellness, just the vibe of the city. I mean, the whole saying, the city that never sleeps, right?
Hmm.
and we actually, there's been research about people's autonomic nervous system, and their sympathetic part of the nervous system, which is the fight, flight, and freeze, gets activated in certain environments. So in a city environment, most people, not everybody and not all the time, but you're more likely to be activated sympathetically than maybe if you're in a country town, right? Makes total sense.
Mhm.
So you already have kind of quite a population here that's skewed more towards being on the anxious side. So in the work that I do with people who have type A personalities and high functioning anxiety is you don't necessarily want to take that high functioning anxiety away. What you want to do is you want to help them cope with not being on the sympathetic part of their nervous system all the time, because what we know from research and I mean, there's just been so much that being on sympathetic all the time is not healthy. It's not how human beings are meant to be. And unfortunately, because of our minds and our ideas of what we're pursuing as being important, we get triggered into, if I don't do this, then oh my God, this is going to happen. And then that makes you so much more anxious and so much more stressed. And when you're stressed and anxious, what happens? Your immune system shuts down. You start to develop autoimmune issues. You start to cope using things that aren't so helpful for you, like caffeine, like alcohol, drugs. Because you can't calm your nervous system down even at night. There's this feeling of being like pretty tired but still feeling wired. So I get a lot of people who have insomnia. It's really helping people, look, you can live the life that you want, but you have to figure out what it is that you want out of your life. What are your priorities? And is it because of what you think, you want because of, say you had a father who was judgmental and only wanted you to become like a CEO, and if you didn't have his like a love or appreciation, the only way to get that was to be successful in this way in school or at work. And even that, what does that mean for you in terms of your physical and emotional well-being? So it's really about trying to help them understand, what are you doing this for? And if it is something that you want to continue to do, that you enjoy the work that you're doing, that's totally fine. But how do you start to implement some parasympathetic part, which is the rest, the digest, the breathing, the breathing? How do you implement things in your life that you can, get that system on? And so that's where the mindfulness meditation stuff comes in. That's where helping people to understand what their sympathetic nervous system response even looks like. I mean, some people go into fight, some people go into flight, some people go into freeze. It depends upon that. So it's really, again, like building that self-awareness and then figuring out what you want out of your life, and then adjusting to what your body needs and what your brain needs to what you think you might want rationally in your life.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do want to jump into the mindfulness meditation piece in a sec, but first I'm curious, just as far as like how many people, I don't know if you can give a percent or just, on average, like the people that come to you, and as you're saying, some people may have this, sort of desperate drive to succeed in some way externally because of, what someone else wanted them to do or what they think society thinks they should do. How many people do you see who are really just doing it, who are just trying to, do it for themselves, to achieve their own goals versus to satisfy someone else's desires?
That's a really great question. And I don't think I really know the answer, but I would say that it's fairly low, because when you scratch the surface of why we do what we do, like there is some sort of like internal motivation that that has been laid out early on in childhood, So I think most people have a lot of anxiety about being in the world, just generally. I think that's like kind of, I would say, pretty universal. And then depending upon your early experiences, how does that kind of get shaped? I would say, I mean, I always go back to this Bonnie Ware. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She wrote this book called The Five Regrets of the Dying.
Huh. No, I don't think
Uh,
so.
yeah, she was a palliative care nurse, and so she wrote this book, and the top five regrets. The first one is, I wish I would have lived a life that I wanted to live and not what others expected of me. I think because there's so much. I think we don't really quite understand often why we do what we do. Again, it's that unconscious. So if we have more awareness about why we're doing what we're doing, we might shift to do something that's actually more beneficial for ourselves and more in alignment with what we want in our lives. Because I don't think that it's healthy to be anxious all the time or to be depressed. Now, of course, when it's, when you need to, because you need to, take care of yourself, or if you're in a life or death situation. But honestly, like, a lot of that isn't really happening now. Well, I mean, I say that with
Hmm.
COVID right now, but uh, prior to all of this,
Right.
still, like, I think the anxiety is just heightened now, generally, because now the reality is that people can die from this, right? So, but to get back to what previously, that first regret is, I wish I would have lived a life that I wanted to live and not what others expected of me. I think sometimes we don't even really realize that we're living a life that others want for us and not that we necessarily want for ourselves. And I think it's so hard to tease that out, right? Because you can, you could say, oh, I've always wanted to be a doctor, but really your mom was the one who put it in you, it's planted that seed early on, and maybe you wouldn't have wanted to do that. I mean, I think that's why therapy is so helpful, because then you can kind of like suss all of that out and figure that what that is for yourself.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it seems like also there has to be just some inherent, like, whatever sort of, success in whatever profession that people are trying to achieve, there seems to be, some inherent sense of, like, you know, trying to get, others' acceptance or admiration, right? Where, you know, we're social creatures, so it makes sense that, we want other people to, see us in a high regard, I guess, even if we think we're, following our dream, and doing it for ourselves. Do you think, it seems like there's some component of whatever, form of success we're looking for, that's like, we want other people to kind of take notice and
Right.
talk about, look at what Victoria's made of herself, or you right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Being seen and being recognized is a primary human need, right?
Right.
It starts off with our caregivers.
Right. Right. Yeah, it seems like a, yeah, very powerful drive.
Well, it's
Cool.
also evolutionary, right? I mean, if we were in the savannas of Africa and we were out, by ourselves and not within the tribe, we were much more likely to not survive. So, so that's a huge part of it too.
Right. Right.
Survive.
Right. And now it's, yeah, so getting kind of excommunicated from society, it could have, like, previously could have killed us, but now it seems like that sort of, like, social isolation, or fear of not being accepted, it there seems to be that same, like, intense fear, that's still kind of part of our brain.
Right. Yeah. The collective unconscious, like we were talking about. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, because public speaking is the top fear for most people. Like, most people would rather die than get up and speak to a crowd of 300 people.
right.
It's rejection. It's the fear of, embarrassing yourself and humiliation. Uh, yeah, it's a really strong primitive way of being that still
Right.
gets out.
Right. And I don't know, maybe, as a segue to kind of talking about meditation, is that something to kind of work on kind of combating that fear, or just in the sense of being able to kind of um, be more resilient at whatever life sort of throws at us?
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, I'm big into research, and there's been like 100,000 different studies on mindfulness and meditation and how helpful it is. Not to mention all the thousands and thousands of years that people have already been doing it in different countries and cultures and religions. Um, and it's really a sense of sitting with yourself, non-judgmentally, with curiosity, and allowing your brain and your body to just kind of be, and to recognize. So the difference is, I do teach meditation, but the difference for me as a therapist with teaching meditation is that it's interesting for me to know what the thoughts that are like kind of grabbing your attention, because they are common. They're common thoughts and common themes that you'll be having. Or what are the feelings that are grabbing your attention? What are the sensations in your body that are grabbing your attention? So there is a level of like awareness in the work that I do with people when we do the, like kind of the meditation. But on their own, I really encourage people to just be able to kind of like to sit with themselves, because our brains are very interesting things. I mean, it wants to, goes on the default mode network, and it'll start thinking about, oh, what am I going to make for breakfast? Or, oh, I can't believe John said that. And so it's really about bringing yourself back to the present moment and being as much as possible with your five senses and your interoceptive senses as well, so that you can combat and decrease your brain going on default mode network to thinking about things that aren't actually really happening, which cause you anxiety, or ruminating about things that have happened in the past, which increases symptoms of depression and grief. I mean, it is important to be able to recognize those symptoms as you're having them, but to be stuck in that place and not be in the real world and be in the here and now is not very healthy. And it's also puts your body in a sympathetic mode, especially if it's much more thinking, more about, or worried more about things, or stressed out about something. So with meditation, I mean, again, there's so much research about what type parts of the area of the brain it helps to expand and helps to decrease. So, I mean, we can get into that, but there's just so much research on it about how helpful it is to just sit with yourself. And it's not even the time, it's really the consistency. So doing it even for 5 minutes every day, where you're concentrating, and I do a lot of pasana, so that's like the mindfulness, so breathing,
Mhm.
because that's very tangible. We're always breathing, and then you can figure out, and you can actually, it also helps you to be more aware of your breath throughout the day when you're not in meditation, because you can see, oh wow, I'm only breathing in for like a second and breathing out for a second. Maybe my sympathetic nervous system is activated for some reason. I wonder why. And being able to bring that back into session, or journaling about it, is very helpful. So I think meditation is probably, I mean, that's the, if I always tell people that that's a practice that they should be doing. And it's really the consistency again. So even doing it for 5 minutes, but doing it daily is very important.
Right, right. And I'm curious, as far as like what you've seen in the research, because I've talked to different friends about it. I had a friend who recommended this book to me called Altered Traits. It was written by Richie Davidson, one of the leading meditation researchers, I think he's at the University of Wisconsin.
Mhm.
And in the book, they talked a lot about, the differences seen in kind of brain imaging studies on people who, were just kind of like daily meditators versus people who did these like intensive work, retreats, these, 3-day silent retreats. And so I was just curious, if you have any thoughts on, um, like the differences. I don't, a lot of people probably aren't gonna, be that dedicated to, give up their phones and their lives for, a few days to just go
Right.
and sit with themselves. But yeah, I'm just curious, what you think the big differences are there.
But, well, that's interesting. I think that if you can implement it in your daily life, just like brushing your teeth, and eating and drinking water, it's probably going to be in the long run much better for you than doing those spurts of the days of meditation.
Hmm.
And not everybody has access to that either, but I think that could be pretty beneficial. But I think having the foundation of doing it daily is probably is healthier, and probably much more, because one of the things that I've noticed, because I read a lot, I haven't read that book, but I read a lot about different spiritual practices and ways of kind of reaching levels of different levels of consciousness. um, I think sometimes we could use that to avoid how we're actually like really feeling and how we're doing. As a matter of fact, there is a defense mechanism called spiritualization, where people will go to this place, and you can do it with meditation, right? Where you can go on these retreats and you're all about like, meditating, but you're not really actually dealing with some internal things that are that probably you want to deal with, or you need to deal with. You don't want to deal with them because you're avoiding them. So I think for everybody, it would depend upon what you want to get out of it. When you start to use anything to avoid how you feel or your thoughts, or the reality of your life, then you kind of run into trouble. So I think they're great, and I think everybody should be able to do those meditation retreats. Just because you will learn more about yourself. You can get to a deeper state of consciousness, and you can see um, how really the reality of the world is not so much the reality, it's your perception of the reality of the world, which I think that's like kind of a higher level of like dealing with it. But I think you first have to deal with all the things that have happened, or not all the things, because you can't possibly, but the things that are making you avoid dealing with things in your life. So I guess it's a roundabout way to say a daily practice, in my opinion, is probably more beneficial but as you're doing the daily practice, that you're also checking in with yourself. You're paying attention to how you feel. You're paying attention to your thoughts, and you're starting to kind of question some of those things. And then, doing those like, week vipassanas or whatever it is, because I've done them too. But I do feel like there can be an avoidance, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, kind of like other ways, other ways besides meditation, maybe to kind of build up that resilience. One thing that just comes to mind, I don't know if you follow any of the research on psychedelics.
A little bit. um, Look, I personally have not, delved into that. I follow a couple of psychiatrists that actually do use and talk about that a lot in their practice, and talk about how it's helpful. I think it can be very helpful, but definitely you have to be working with somebody who knows what they're doing, and can and has a passion for it, I think, and who's also done it themselves. um, I think that could be very, very helpful, because there's just so much that we don't know about our brains and how it
Hmm.
functions. what happens. I'm also like, just a little bit more reserved about that kind of stuff because, it could lead to a psychotic break. I mean, it doesn't happen for everybody, that's for sure. But, you really just have to be careful and, do it with somebody who is qualified and trained and licensed. Because I know a couple of people who do microdosing of mushrooms, and not necessarily under uh, the watch of anybody
Mm.
professional. So you get a little concerned about that. But look, I think we have all of these tools, and we are really just at the end of the day, just trying to feel better.
Mm.
Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the things that we're using to feel better are externally outside of ourselves, and that's another concern. But again, in terms of neurotransmitters and the biology, whatever is happening in our brains, like, there could be some misfiring, there could be, a limited amount of, serotonin or dopamine or whatever it is that we don't know, and we can never really tell without actually trying these things out. And that's why when people, start psychiatric medication, there's really no science to it except that, if somebody in your family had depression, they were on Lexapro, and it worked for them, they'll try that first. If
Mhm.
that doesn't work, then they'll try Wellbutrin. If that doesn't work, they'll try, there's that kind of science where they'll, figure out what could help you the most. The problem is that we really don't know. And then we don't know with the psychedelics. So I really actually kind of go more towards the things that you could do for yourself that help you to connect more internally. So, you know, uh, meditation and mindfulness is my go-to. Yoga is great and amazing at connecting not only your mind, but your mind, body, brain together, and decreasing that nervous system response. Martial arts is great. Tai Chi, Qigong is good. There's so many different things that people that are alternative ways, breathing practices, pranayama. There's so many alternative ways holistically that I think I probably would look at first before
Mm.
psychedelics. But look, people are suffering, and if you're suffering a lot and you have tried all of these things, or you need more of an immediate, um, more of an immediate response, than trying some of these other ways that kind of externally help you to get to a place where you can maybe even get to a place where you can meditate. Because a lot of people, it's very hard for them to actually start meditating,
Mhm.
because they can't calm their brains down. So I know it was a long answer for that question, but
Yeah.
that's
No, that
kind of it.
yeah. No, I mean it seems like I mean taking care of the basics, you know, taking control of our nervous systems and, making sure that I mean, stuff as simple as like breathing, right? It's like breathing like everyone we're all doing it anyway, but most of us don't think about it or don't control it. So it makes sense that something like that or yoga could be incredibly effective.
Mhm.
I'm curious, just as far as moving forward in psychology or psychiatry, what sort of things do you think we're going to see changing in the future? Do you think we're going to see more of this sort of wellness, psychotherapy that you're talking about, where people there seems to be this sort of societal or like Western societal shift towards more natural remedies or more holistic sort of treatment approaches compared to you know just popping a pill and hoping that it's going to work out.
Yeah. Well, because it doesn't use, I mean, it works out for some people, but not for everybody. I mean, I've worked with so many people who started taking medication, and, really, again, it goes to what we talked about earlier. It's the self-awareness of what it is, what are the triggers that are going on for somebody, and why they, what that triggers in terms of their feelings or their thoughts and their behaviors. So a lot of it's like this, the cognitive behavioral therapy is a big part of that. Acceptance and commitment therapy is actually goes a bit deeper than cognitive behavioral therapy, because it's more about accepting, being committed to, what you want your life to look like. That's why, the purpose and meaning is so important to the work that I do. And then, living your life based on that. So I think where I see things going is, the stigma hopefully will be decreased. That really frustrates me, because anybody who has had any kind of like trauma or experience in their life, all of that shapes who you are now. I mean, that's, your early experiences, we know, are implicitly in your mind, particularly, I guess your right brain is, what they think. And it's not until, later on where you start to get the more cognitive, higher level functionings of a human, in terms of attention, concentration, those things, that you can make meaning and understanding of the implicit part of your brain. So I'm hoping that there'll be more research about that, and we can utilize that more. And using all of these different wellness practices, like you said earlier, I mean, we're coming to a point where just taking a medication is not helpful for, I don't even know what the statistic is, but for most people. And also too, I mean, I just had a thought, which was, is something that I get frustrated with, is that like a lot of the people who are prescribing those medications are not even psychiatrists or psychiatric nurse practitioners. They're physicians, and you tell them, oh, I'm depressed. I lost my mom 3 months ago. Oh, okay, well, let me give you an antidepressant so that you can deal with it. And there's just so much more that needs to be dealt with and worked through and processed, that medication it can never do, no matter how much serotonin, it inhibits, or, it inhibits. There's just no, and there's no substitute for having a human connection and conversation that from somebody who's like really listening and really paying attention. So I think actually therapy is going to be less stigmatized, and people will be doing it much more regularly. That's my hope. And that the therapist will be much more holistically oriented and focus on, okay, biological functionings, what's happening there physiologically with you. I mean, sleep is like the foundation of everything. If you're not sleeping well, your mood is impacted. What you choose to eat is impacted. How the feelings of fatigue that your body budget is impacted. So, really kind of getting people to understand how to first and foremost take care of themselves physically and physiologically, and have a sense of safety and connectedness, not only with other people, but also with something bigger than them too. So I think that the spiritual piece and connection is going to be something really big. And probably because, people are trying these psychedelics, there is a question of how, like, consciousness, right? And what is consciousness? And from my experience and from reading the limited amount of research that I've read on it and like books and stuff, that there is a questioning of consciousness and an expansion that there's something bigger when people are taking psychedelics. I think Michael Pollan, he wrote the book about psychedelics. I can't remember what it's called, but he writes about food. And I think the reason why he started writing about psychedelics was because his father had cancer, and he wanted to try to figure out, how could I help my father? What could I do? And I think in his research, what he came to find was that people were giving psychedelics to cancer patients who were in hospice or, you know, had like just a limited amount of time to live. And they were freaking out about the idea of death and dying because they didn't know where they were going to go. The fear of the unknown, right? To go back to what we were talking about before this, is the uncertainty. When your brain doesn't know what's going to happen, then it freaks out. So being able to be connected to something bigger or understand consciousness, a one consciousness, if that's what, you know, you believe, or God or something bigger, I think is also going to be something that's going to be more implemented more in psychotherapy. And I think that's just probably where it's going to go, because I mean, we've been in the pharmaceutical stage for a while now, and guess what keeps on increasing? Depression and anxiety. It's gotten worse. And as a matter of fact, I think the World Health Organization says, like, within a few years, like, you know, the top reason for death is going to be depressive related disorders and issues. So, well, maybe it's not death, but of people not being able to work. That's what it is. Is depression. And we already know that, you know, anxiety and stress account for like 80% of the visits in, you know, for the medical professionals. When people go to see a doctor, it's really related to stress. It's really related to anxiety, which is related to that core feeling of fear and fearing the unknown, or fearing what's going to happen to you. And I think that we're going to have to take more of a holistic approach, because what we're doing now isn't really working.
Right. Well said. I was just thinking, you know, what do you think about those? I've seen a couple of those like ads for those apps, those like therapy apps, I think just like on Instagram or something. But I mean, it's an interesting potential model where, instead of having to, go and, meet with a therapist once a week or whatever it is, where you could just kind of have access to that person. So whenever you're experiencing something difficult or having a rough night, or, whatever it may be, if you sort of have that person, have kind of a more of an ease of access. Do you see that as kind of like really exploding in the future, or do you think it's kind of more of a fad?
I actually, I would not have said this prior to 3 weeks ago, but I think that it probably will. I think it's great, because anytime anybody feels less alone and more supported is amazing. And we have an epidemic of loneliness in this country. And it goes to, I think, to our priorities. Our priorities are not really each other. It's, status, money, power. I'm hoping things will shift. And it seems like they might be, but I think actually those are very helpful, to dip your toe into connecting with somebody. I think most people are afraid of therapy and of a therapist. And that's also part of the reason why I kind of coined the term wellness psychotherapist, because, when you hear, oh, I'm seeing a psychotherapist, or I'm seeing a therapist, people freak out. There's a stigma. Oh, there must be something really wrong with me, or I might be crazy, So I think that it actually will help decrease the stigma, and it will help people get to a therapist's office at some point in their life, because they'll hopefully find the benefit from it. So I'm hopeful that's a great way to connect and to get people to come to therapy. But again, I've been doing the virtual sessions, because we're on lockdown here.
Sure.
For the last 3 weeks. And luckily I have a relationship with all the people that I'm working with. I don't know what it would be like to start off a relationship virtually. I mean, I've done some like wellness stuff virtually with groups because of COVID-19, but I haven't started seeing any individual person through the virtual visits. So I'm not really quite sure. I mean, I'm sure it'll be fine because it's like the reality of the situation. This is what we have to do. But there's nothing that takes the place of having a relationship with somebody personally where you feel their energy, where I mean we co-regulate ourselves with each other, right? So we have 80 different facial muscles in our face. And just a small like furrowing the brow or like squinting, whatever it is, like you're interpreting my facial expressions and I'm interpreting yours. And it's challenging to do that over video. You can do it, but I find it's a little bit more difficult. And then also the energy that you have when you're with somebody in a personal setting, you know
Hmm.
physically. We know that, and I think we're going to unfortunately feel the ramifications of that within the next couple of weeks, more so than now. If you have just a few people that you can socially connect with because we're all socially distancing, um, that's amazing that you have at least one or two people. But what is it going to be like for us as human beings, because we're not used to being in these kinds of situations, to not have that like physical connection? So it makes me think that yes, it's great, all of these services for online therapy. I think the least uh, I guess one that I don't feel good about is the texting. I don't really think that that's that helpful, but I think the virtual, auto, calling or virtual visits are very helpful. But again, anything to make people feel less alone is great and going to be
Right.
better.
Absolutely. This is something really random, but it just came to mind when you brought up about, what the 80 facial muscles. I don't know if
Yeah.
you had seen something. So there was like something about uh, they found that people who got Botox or like a lot of Botox done, that it actually like inhibited like their ability to feel. I forgot if it was like feel or to perceive other people's emotions, because it's like they're not able to display the facial correlates of emotion,
Yeah.
so you've seen that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Funny because it's a as a woman just generally like we're always worried about how we look, and so I think yeah, there's no way that I would ever be able to do that. I've seen some therapists who do have Botox, and people who have Botox just generally, and it's harder. So if I'm like looking like this and you're like, what the heck is she like, what is her facial like expression saying to me, then
mhm,
you're confused, and then I'm going to be
yeah,
confused because of we are co-regulating with each other.
right,
So it's really interesting. And yeah, I think again it again goes back to like, what do you value, what's a priority? Like, yeah, we want to be youthful, we want to like look good. As a matter of fact, that's generally why people like, exercise and take care of themselves, is more for vanity than anything else. But the really is having having like good relationships and connecting with people and being able to support and love one another. Because out of all those regrets that Bonnie Ware is talking about, they're all about like, how do you show up for yourself first and foremost, your authentic self, and how do you show up for other people and connecting with other people and having relationships. And so the more authentic you are with who you are and what's happening to you, even if it's not like aesthetically exciting and pleasing, the better you are, in terms of connecting with yourself and being authentic with yourself and being authentic with others.
well said. I really like that, and I think this is a great place to kind of wrap up. As far as Any resources, Victoria, that you would direct people to, or anything that you'd like to plug?
Sure. So I have been for a while doing these mental health wellness Wednesdays on Instagram and on Facebook. And on Instagram, I'm at Wellness Psychotherapist. On Facebook, you can, I guess, look me up, just Wellness Psychotherapist. I have a Facebook page. It's very similar, the content. I have a website, Victoria Rivera, lcsw.com, or Wellness Psychotherapist, nyc.com. And the content that I have is all really about like kind of helping people to understand themselves. And I focus more on, building self-awareness first and foremost, being accepting of who you are and yourself and how you react. And that's like what we talked about before, understanding your biology just as a human, and then your biology given your experiences with growing up and your family, your temperament, like all of those things. And then having compassion, self-compassion, and being able to feel for yourself and take care of yourself just like you would anybody that you loved. Because I think a lot of us don't feel good enough about ourselves. We don't feel worth it, So talk a lot about, the probability of, you being born, of me being born, and what, like, quote unquote, a miracle it actually is. And all of us have something internally within us that we need to get out into the world. And what ends up, holding us back really is all of that, like, psychological kind of like mess that we have to kind of like through to bring that out. And then the self-regulation stuff, which is really about like, like the meditation and yoga. How do you start these practices, especially when it's very hard for us to change our habits, to change our minds about things. So that content, it's all around that. That's all the content that I have. And the last 4 weeks I've been doing a lot about mental health triage and COVID-19, because, no matter where you are in the world, it's affecting you. And, we all have our own personal issues and problems. And now we have this overarching anxiety and cloud over us, and uncertainty that our brains are trying to like figure out and deal with. And it's very, very difficult. So I have some mental health triage stuff that I think is very helpful. So
Awesome.
out there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for coming on the show. And if you guys did enjoy the show today, check us out on YouTube, Roscoe's Wetsuit. You can see the video version of the podcast there. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio if you just want the audio. And go follow us on Instagram at Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. All right. Thanks so much again, Victoria.
you.
All
Thank you.
right. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
All right. Bye.